17-year-old high school student Mason sat in the interrogation room with a chilling smirk that made seasoned detectives sick to their stomachs. He laughed when shown pictures of the shattered family he had destroyed, treating the devastating crime like a mere prank. He genuinely believed his clever planning and youth would grant him a free pass back to his comfortable life. But the voice that would ultimately lock him in a concrete cell for the rest of his days wasn't a detective's or a judge's. It was his absolute best friend's. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way, often from the people the guilty trust the most. If you believe in absolute accountability and want to see how sheer arrogance leads to a spectacular downfall, subscribe now and tell us your thoughts in the comments below. This is how it all began. Just a week before that sickening laugh echoed through the precinct, Mason was known as the charismatic star athlete of his quiet, leafy suburban town. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew each other, where front porches were brightly lit and dark secrets were supposedly non-existent. But beneath Mason's charming, perfectly crafted facade hid a deeply broken moral compass. When a horrific tragedy struck a local family on a rainy Tuesday night, the entire town was paralyzed with fear, assuming a random outsider was to blame. They had no idea the real threat was sitting in their own classrooms, eating lunch at their tables, and secretly bragging about his untouchable status to the one person he thought would never betray him. Mason was the golden boy of Crestview High, a 17-year-old varsity captain whose confident stride commanded the school hallways. To the community, he was the picture of a promising future, blessed with athletic talent and a magnetic charm that made him universally adored. Teachers praised his leadership, and parents pointed to him as a role model for their own children. But behind the winning smiles and the shiny trophies lay a disturbing void of empathy. He viewed the world as his personal playground, a stage where consequences were meant for ordinary people, not for someone of his elevated status. This deeply ingrained arrogance blinded him to the gravity of human life, setting the stage for a tragedy that would soon shatter the quiet suburban illusion. Just 3 blocks from Mason's sprawling family home lived the Miller family, known for their quiet kindness and open-door policy. They were the heartbeat of the neighborhood, hosting summer barbecues and always willing to lend a helping hand. On that rainy Tuesday night, the Millers were simply settling in for a quiet evening, unaware that a predator was stalking through the familiar, rain-soaked streets. The sudden, brutal invasion of their home was completely senseless, a nightmare of violence that left the community reeling in disbelief. The sheer ferocity of the crime pointed away from a robbery and toward something deeply personal and intensely hateful. Yet no one could fathom who would target such a gentle family. When the sun rose the next morning, the once peaceful neighborhood was transformed into a chaotic maze of yellow police tape and flashing patrol lights. Neighbors stood on their manicured lawns in absolute shock, whispering fearful theories about a transient killer or a botched home invasion. The air was thick with a suffocating dread as investigators carried out the grim task of processing a scene that defied logical explanation. In the midst of this overwhelming collective grief, Mason stood with his classmates at the edge of the police barricades, playing the role of the devastated neighbor to absolute perfection. He offered comforting hugs and somber nods, his performance flawlessly masking the monstrous reality of his own actions the night before. But his performance was merely a game, a thrilling test of his own perceived superiority over the local authorities. While the town mourned and locked their doors in terror, Mason was actively reveling in the chaos he had secretly orchestrated. He attended the candlelight vigils, standing near the grieving relatives, feeling an intoxicating rush of power as he watched them weep for the lives he had stolen. To him, the police were nothing more than incompetent actors in a movie where he was the untouchable director. He thought his meticulous planning, the complete lack of physical evidence, and his stellar reputation created an impenetrable fortress around him, guaranteeing his absolute freedom from any suspicion. The facade, however, required constant maintenance, and Mason's ego was too massive to keep his dark secret entirely to himself. The thrill of the crime was fading, replaced by an overwhelming desire to be recognized for his twisted brilliance. He needed an audience, someone to validate his dangerous sense of genius. That audience was his lifelong best friend, Julian, a quiet and fiercely loyal teenager who lived entirely in Mason's shadow. Mason trusted Julian implicitly, viewing him more as an obedient subordinate than a true equal. He believed Julian was too timid to ever speak out, making him the perfect receptacle for a confession that was born not out of guilt, but out of sheer, unadulterated vanity. Late one evening, while playing video games in the safety of his bedroom, Mason carelessly let the mask slip completely. With a chillingly casual tone, he detailed the horrific events of that rainy Tuesday night, laughing at the memory of the victim's final moments as if recounting a funny movie scene. Julian sat frozen, the controllers slipping from his trembling hands, as the horrifying reality of his best friend's nature washed over him. Mason didn't notice the terror in Julian's eyes. He was too busy admiring his own reflection in the television screen. He ended his sick confession with a confident smirk, assuring Julian that the police were clueless and that they would carry this secret to their graves. What Mason failed to understand was that loyalty has a breaking point, especially when weighed against the crushing burden of a devastating double loss. Julian spent sleepless nights, tortured by the victims' faces and the echoing sound of Mason's heartless laughter. The crushing guilt eventually outweighed the childhood bond, leading Julian to walk through the heavy glass doors of the local police precinct. He sat nervously in a sterile room and poured out every damning detail, handing the detectives the exact timeline and the hidden weapon location that only the true killer could possibly know. The invincible fortress Mason had built in his mind was systematically dismantled by the one person he thought he owned. Armed with Julian's devastating testimony, investigators moved swiftly, shattering the peaceful illusion of Mason's privileged life. The golden boy was pulled from his high school classroom in handcuffs, his arrogant stride replaced by the awkward shuffle of a captured suspect. Even as he was placed in the holding cell, Mason maintained a defiant sneer, entirely convinced that his friend's word would never hold up against his star athlete reputation. He thought he could lie his way out, just as he always had. He didn't realize that the gears of justice had already locked him into a trap from which there was no escape. The smirk remained for now, but its days were strictly numbered. The cold fluorescent lights of the interrogation room cast harsh, unforgiving shadows over Mason's relaxed posture as he sat comfortably across from two veteran detectives. He leaned back in his metal chair, his arms casually crossed behind his head, projecting the powerful aura of a teenager who was merely suffering through a minor, temporary inconvenience. When the lead detective placed grim photographs of the shattered Miller home on the steel table, fully expecting to see a sudden flicker of remorse, or at least panic in the boy's eyes, Mason did the absolute unthinkable. He let out a soft, genuinely amused chuckle, shaking his head side to side as if he were looking at a mildly entertaining comic strip rather than the devastating aftermath of a family's destruction. He confidently recited his meticulously pre-rehearsed alibi, claiming he had spent the entire Tuesday evening safely in his basement, deeply engrossed in a competitive multiplayer video game. He spoke with the polished, practiced cadence of a seasoned politician, his words incredibly smooth and completely devoid of any genuine emotional weight or human empathy. In his deeply twisted mind, this police interrogation was simply an entertaining chess match against vastly inferior opponents, and he firmly believed he was already several moves ahead. He genuinely thought that without a physical weapon or direct DNA tying him to the chaotic scene, the authorities were desperately grasping at invisible straws to close a high-profile case. He looked the exhausted detectives dead in the eyes, offering a hollow, deeply arrogant smile, entirely convinced that his elevated status as a local golden boy made him inherently untouchable. He confidently assumed his loyal best friend Julian was currently at home, keeping his mouth firmly shut out of sheer obedience, admiration, and fear. But the seasoned detectives were not playing the naive game Mason arrogantly thought they were playing. They were simply letting him build his own inescapable cage of lies, brick by brick. They listened patiently as he locked himself into a rigid, highly specific timeline, his massive ego noticeably expanding with every single unchallenged statement he casually made. He shamelessly bragged about his recent athletic achievements and his incredibly bright academic future, subtly suggesting that someone of his exceptional caliber and social standing would never stoop to such senseless, chaotic behavior. It was an absolute masterclass in dark manipulation, a chilling, real-time display of a psychological void existing exactly where a human soul should have been. For the viewers who would eventually watch this interrogation tape, it was a moment designed to trigger pure, unadulterated rage, seeing a privileged teenager casually dismiss the monumental value of innocent lives while eagerly polishing his own imagined crown. Would you be able to sit across from that remorseless, laughing face and keep your professional composure? The investigators expertly masked their intense disgust, nodding thoughtfully along as Mason spun his intricate, deceptive web. They knew with absolute certainty that outside that sterile room, forensics teams were already recovering the discarded dark clothing from the exact storm drain Julian had specifically pointed them toward hours ago. They knew that Mason's hidden digital footprint directly and undeniably contradicted his supposedly airtight video game alibi. Every incredibly confident word falling from Mason's lips was just another heavy nail in his eventual coffin, but his overwhelming vanity rendered him completely blind to the steel trap rapidly closing around him. He thought he was effortlessly outsmarting the entire criminal justice system, completely unaware that his entire foundation was built on the fragile silence of a friend who had already shattered it into pieces. The heavy atmosphere in the small room shifted imperceptibly when the lead detective finally stopped taking notes, deliberately closed his manila folder, and leaned forward, instantly shattering the comfortable conversational rhythm Mason had established. The detective didn't raise his voice. Instead, he softly asked Mason why his personal phone's GPS had pinged off a local cell tower less than 50 feet from the Miller residence at the exact time he vehemently claimed to be dominating a digital battlefield. Mason's arrogant, self-assured smile froze, hanging awkwardly and unnaturally on his face as his rapidly panicking brain scrambled to calculate this entirely unexpected variable. Before he could formulate a new, plausible lie, the second detective casually slid a printed transcript across the metal table, a documented text message Mason had sent to Julian just minutes after the chaos, containing a chilling, celebratory phrase that only the true culprit could possibly know. The warm color slowly drained from the teenager's previously confident face, quickly replaced by a pale, sickly realization that his impenetrable, invincible fortress was entirely fictional. He nervously tried to laugh the evidence off, desperately attempting to dismiss the damning message as a dark, tasteless joke taken completely out of context. But the sudden, undeniable tremor in his voice betrayed his rapidly rising panic. The detectives stood up in unison, their silent, heavy authority completely filling the small room, leaving Mason isolated and suffocating beneath the horrifying, crushing weight of his newly discovered reality. The entertaining game he thought he was winning was officially over, and the former golden boy was about to face a very public stage he could not charm his way out of. The smirk finally disappeared, replaced by the terrifying dawn of impending justice. The transition from the sterile interrogation room to the grandiose, mahogany-paneled courtroom was a harsh awakening for the former golden boy. Weeks had passed since his arrest, and the media circus had officially descended upon the quiet suburban town, transforming Mason's trial into a national spectacle. Reporters lined the courthouse steps, their cameras flashing relentlessly as the transport van arrived. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocatingly heavy, charged with the collective grief of a shattered community and the burning desire for absolute accountability. The Miller family sat in the front row, holding on to each other for support, their faces etched with a profound sorrow that no amount of time could ever fully erase. The stage was set for a highly public reckoning, and the entire town was holding its breath. Despite the overwhelming gravity of the situation, Mason sauntered into the courtroom wearing a tailored suit that seemed to mock the solemnity of the proceedings. He had somehow managed to reconstruct his shattered ego behind the concrete walls of the county jail, convincing himself once again that his family's expensive legal team would easily dismantle the prosecution's case. He offered a slight, confident nod to his visibly anxious parents, projecting an aura of undisturbed calm that sent waves of intense disgust through the gallery. He leaned back in his heavy leather chair, actively chewing the inside of his cheek to suppress an arrogant grin. To him, the judge, the jury, and the grieving family were still just background characters in his personal narrative of invincibility. The defense immediately launched into a theatrical, highly polished opening statement designed to muddy the clear waters of truth. They painted Mason as a tragic victim of intense academic pressure and circumstantial misunderstandings, completely ignoring the calculated brutality of the crime. High-priced experts were paraded before the jury, attempting to spin a web of psychological excuses that blamed violent video games and youthful impulsivity rather than acknowledging pure, unadulterated malice. They desperately tried to suggest that the digital evidence was entirely circumstantial and easily manipulated, hoping to plant a single seed of reasonable doubt in the minds of the attentive jurors. Mason watched his lawyers work with immense satisfaction, silently applauding their ability to twist reality to suit his desperate narrative. But the lead prosecutor, a seasoned veteran who had seen every trick in the legal playbook, was fully prepared to shatter the defense's carefully constructed illusions. When it was the state's turn to speak, there was no theatrical pacing or dramatic shouting. There was only the cold, undeniable weight of meticulously gathered facts. The prosecutor methodically laid out the timeline, connecting the recovered dark clothing and the damning cell phone records with absolute, undeniable precision. The jury's eyes widened as they saw the sheer amount of undeniable calculation required to execute such a devastating plan. The prosecution wasn't just proving a tragedy had occurred. They were exposing the chilling, predatory mindset of a teenager who viewed human life as entirely disposable. The heavy courtroom doors swung open, and the prosecution called their star witness, instantly draining every ounce of color from Mason's confident face. Julian walked slowly down the center aisle, his shoulders slumped under the unbearable weight of the truth he was about to unleash. He refused to look at the defense table, keeping his eyes firmly fixed on the judge as he swore to tell the whole truth. When Julian finally spoke, his voice trembled, but his words cut through the silent room like a sharpened blade. He recounted the horrific, laughing confession exactly as he had heard it, detailing the secret knowledge that only the true perpetrator could possess, completely destroying Mason's carefully fabricated alibi. Hearing the intimate details of the crime casually recalled by a former best friend sent a collective shudder through the crowded gallery. The sheer pettiness of Mason's motives, driven entirely by ego and a dark thirst for excitement, fueled an intense, burning rage among those listening. It forces us to ask a difficult question. If you were sitting on that jury, staring at a young man who threw away innocent lives simply for the thrill of the game, could you ever find it in your heart to forgive him? The chilling reality of a monster hiding behind a varsity jacket and a winning smile was now completely exposed for the world to see. There was no more hiding behind expensive lawyers or small-town privilege. The raw, ugly truth was undeniable. As Julian concluded his devastating testimony, the deafening silence in the courtroom spoke volumes louder than any legal argument ever could. Mason slumped forward in his chair, his expensive suit suddenly looking far too large for his shrinking, defeated frame. The terrifying realization that his absolute best friend had willingly handed him over to justice finally pierced through his thick armor of malignant narcissism. The grand illusion of his superior intellect and untouchable status had completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a frightened, trapped individual staring down the barrel of a lifetime behind bars. He turned his head to look at the jury, but found only cold, unforgiving stares reflecting his own guilt back at him. The arrogant sneer was permanently wiped from his face. The heavy oak doors of the jury room clicked shut, leaving the packed courtroom in a state of suffocating, anxious suspension. For the Miller family, every passing minute felt like an eternity of holding their collective breath, praying that the 12 men and women entrusted with the truth had seen through the defense's elaborate smoke and mirrors. They didn't have to wait long. Less than 3 hours after deliberations began, the jarring buzz of the courtroom intercom signaled that a unanimous decision had already been reached. Mason was escorted back to the defense table, his earlier swagger completely replaced by a rigid, terrified stiffness. The confident high school athlete who once believed he could outsmart the entire world was now visibly trembling, his knuckles completely white as he gripped the edge of the heavy wooden table. When the forepersons stood and loudly read the verdict of guilty on all counts, a collective, tearful gasp of profound relief washed over the entire gallery. Mason's knees immediately buckled beneath him, his perfectly constructed illusion of invincibility shattering into a million irreparable pieces right there on the courtroom floor. He frantically looked toward his high-priced attorneys, silently pleading for a legal loophole or a sudden objection, but they simply stared straight ahead, defeated by the undeniable mountain of evidence. The boy who had casually laughed at the brutal destruction of an innocent family was finally experiencing the crushing, inescapable weight of genuine, paralyzing fear. Realizing that his privileged name and athletic trophies could not shield him from the absolute finality of justice. Weeks later, the highly anticipated sentencing hearing brought the devastating emotional arc of the tragedy to its ultimate climax. The prosecution invited the surviving relatives of the Miller family to the podium, allowing them to directly address the monster who had permanently altered their lives for nothing more than a sick thrill. Through flowing tears, they painted a beautiful, heartbreaking picture of the warm, loving home that had been violently stolen, ensuring the court remembered the profound value of the lives lost, rather than just the infamy of the killer. Mason sat slumped in his chair, actively refusing to make eye contact with the grieving family, his jaw tightly clenched in a final, pathetic display of stubborn defiance. When the veteran judge finally leaned forward to deliver his sentencing remarks, the entire room fell into a deathly, reverent silence. The judge did not hold back, systematically dismantling Mason's arrogant psychology and exposing him not as a tragic victim of circumstance, but as a deeply calculated, malignant predator disguised in a varsity jacket. He sternly pointed out the sheer cowardice of the crime, highlighting how Mason had arrogantly believed his social status granted him the terrifying authority to play God with innocent lives. The judge's booming voice echoed off the mahogany walls, explicitly stating that true monsters are not always the boogeymen hiding in the dark. Sometimes they are the charming, popular kids who simply lack the fundamental human capacity for empathy and remorse. With a heavy, uncompromising tone, the judge declared that a society could never be truly safe with someone so devoid of basic humanity walking freely among them. He officially sentenced the 17-year-old to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that Mason would take his final breath surrounded by cold concrete and unforgiving steel bars. The reality of a permanent, miserable existence, completely stripped of freedom, privilege, and adoring audiences, finally broke the teenager's fragile facade, causing him to openly sob and loudly beg for a leniency he never showed his victims. Children make tragic mistakes, but remorseless predators make calculated decisions, the judge coldly replied, effectively silencing the boy's desperate, self-serving tears before bringing the heavy wooden gavel down with a deafening crack. Heavily armed bailiffs immediately stepped forward, physically dragging the sobbing, defeated teenager out of the courtroom as the gallery watched in stunned, vindicated silence. The tragic story of the Golden Boy, who thought he was entirely untouchable, came to its definitive, poetic end, proving that no amount of arrogance or local fame can outrun the relentless pursuit of the truth. Mason started his horrifying journey by laughing at the unimaginable pain of others, fully convinced he would simply walk away. But he ended it as a broken, forgotten prisoner whose only remaining companion would be the crushing regret of his own hubris. The smirk was gone forever, permanently replaced by the agonizing realization that he had engineered his own spectacular, inescapable downfall. The heavy iron doors of the state penitentiary slammed shut, sealing Mason in a world permanently devoid of privilege and admiring fans. Stripped of his varsity jacket, he was forced into a drab uniform that rendered him entirely anonymous among the hardened inmates. There were no more leniencies to exploit. There was only the cold reality of a concrete cell and a rigid daily routine that offered absolutely no escape. He spent his endless days staring at the gray walls, the echoes of his arrogant laughter completely replaced by the deafening silence of isolation. The grand life he had envisioned dissolved into a miserable loop of regret, proving the ultimate price for his vanity was his future. Back in the quiet streets of Crestview, the deep scars left by Mason's horrific betrayal slowly began to heal, though the town would never fully reclaim its former innocence. Julian, the unexpected hero who bravely shattered his friend's illusion of invincibility, carried the heavy burden of that tragic night long after the media departed. He was hailed as a courageous protector of justice, yet he quietly struggled with the haunting memory of the boy he thought he knew. The community rallied around him, ensuring he never felt isolated for making the agonizing choice to stand up for the truth. His bravery became a quiet testament to the enduring power of profound moral integrity. The beautiful Miller home was eventually sold, its blooming garden lovingly restored by new owners as a quiet memorial to the family whose lives were so senselessly stolen. The story of the arrogant athlete who believed you could outsmart the world serves as a chilling reminder that justice is an unrelenting, uncompromising force. We are left to wonder how many smiling faces hide similar depths, and whether we would have the courage to speak up in Julian's impossible position. True accountability demands a heavy toll, but it remains the only foundation upon which a shattered community can rebuild. If you value the relentless pursuit of truth, subscribe now and share your thoughts below. The town of Crestview could not simply wash away the stains of Mason's horrific betrayal, and the community's profound loss of innocence lingered for years. Parents quietly began looking at their own children differently, terrified of what dark, hidden secrets might be lurking behind closed bedroom doors and seemingly innocent group chats. The local high school, once a place of vibrant, boundless adolescent energy, transformed into a somber monument to the devastating tragedy. The sparkling glass trophy cases that had once proudly celebrated Mason's undeniable athletic prowess were quietly emptied and permanently repurposed. It was a harsh, collective awakening to the terrifying reality that absolute evil does not always arrive wearing a threatening disguise. Sometimes it wears a varsity letter and a charming, winning smile. For Julian, the slow passage of time offered only a muted comfort, as the deep psychological trauma of his impossible moral decision lingered like a heavy, suffocating fog. He eventually graduated high school quietly, deliberately avoiding the bright spotlight that had once so eagerly chased his former best friend, and dedicated his adult life to studying criminal psychology. He wanted to understand the unexplainable void he had witnessed firsthand, frequently speaking at victim advocacy seminars to share his harrowing experience of recognizing the monster hiding in plain sight. His quiet, purposeful life became a powerful testament to the fact that, while doing the right thing is rarely painless, it remains the absolute only way to prevent total darkness from completely taking over. As Mason continues to slowly age behind the cold, unforgiving concrete walls of the maximum security state penitentiary, his once prominent name has entirely faded from the eager headlines. He is no longer a celebrated local star, but merely a cautionary whisper, spending his endless days trapped in a monotonous, inescapable cycle of total isolation. He is entirely stripped of the grand, adoring audience and the deeply privileged status he once foolishly believed made him an untouchable god among ordinary men. This chilling, heartbreaking case remains a stark, undeniable reminder that true, unyielding justice cannot be outsmarted, easily manipulated, or bought. If this dive into the dark psychology of teenage arrogance kept you captivated, make sure to subscribe and tell us below if true closure is ever really possible. Even as the heavy prison doors slammed shut, Mason's deeply ingrained sense of entitlement refused to completely die, fueled largely by his parents' absolute refusal to accept reality. His mother and father, desperate to protect their shattered social standing in the affluent Crestview community, immediately poured their vast financial resources into a frantic, high-profile appeals process. They hired a new team of ruthless appellate lawyers who scoured the original trial transcripts, desperately searching for any microscopic procedural error or technical loophole that could invalidate Julian's damning testimony. They launched a quiet but aggressive whisper campaign within their elite circles, attempting to paint Julian not as a courageous whistleblower, but as a jealous, manipulative liar who had successfully framed their perfect golden boy. This pathetic display of profound denial only served to further alienate the family from the mourning community, as residents watched in absolute disgust while the parents chose blind vanity over basic human decency. They simply could not fathom that the predator who had mercilessly destroyed an innocent family had been sitting at their own polished dining table every single night, actively deceiving them with a charming smile. However, the state's appellate courts proved entirely immune to the family's wealth, prestige, and meticulously crafted illusions of suburban perfection. Month after month, year after year, every single desperate motion filed by Mason's expensive legal team was systematically and coldly rejected by veteran judges who saw right through the transparent legal maneuvering. The original trial's evidence, the recovered dark clothing, the undeniable cell phone tower pings, and the chilling, remorseless text messages remained an impenetrable fortress of truth that no amount of money could ever dismantle. With each successive legal defeat, Mason's behavior inside the maximum security facility grew increasingly erratic and bitter as the terrifying permanence of his bleak situation finally began to crush his fragile narcissistic ego. He was no longer the charismatic varsity captain commanding the admiration of his peers. He was just another anonymous, forgotten inmate who had traded his entire future for a fleeting, sickening moment of absolute control. The agonizing realization that his family's money could not buy his freedom slowly drove him into a deep, inescapable despair, completely shattering the false god complex he had worshipped his entire life. Ultimately, the tragic saga of the Crestview Golden Boy serves as a haunting, unforgettable masterclass in the terrifying depths of arrogance and the absolute inevitability of justice. It forces us to confront the deeply uncomfortable reality that the most dangerous threats do not always lurk in dark alleyways. Sometimes they sleep in the bedroom just down the hall, hiding their horrific darkness behind a collection of shiny sports trophies and a well-rehearsed persona. Julian's agonizing but heroic decision to betray his best friend in the name of the truth remains the only sliver of light in this incredibly dark, devastating narrative. His immense courage ensured that a remorseless individual was permanently removed from society, preventing who knows how many future tragedies from unfolding at the hands of a teenager who genuinely thought he was entirely untouchable. As the years march on, and the memory of Mason's arrogant courtroom smirk permanently fades into obscurity, the uncompromising weight of the law stands tall as a protective shield for the innocent. If you found this deep dive into the psychology of a teenage criminal compelling, please subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments if you believe true rehabilitation is ever possible for someone so devoid of empathy. To truly understand the chilling nature of this case, we have to look beyond the heavy oak doors of the courtroom and gaze directly into the deeply unsettling psychology of a teenage predator. Criminal psychologists who later analyzed Mason's behavior noted that his pristine, affluent upbringing did not prevent his dark descent. In many ways, it actively accelerated it. He was a textbook example of juvenile, malignant narcissism, a terrifying condition where a child develops an impenetrable shield of grandiosity to mask an absolute void of human empathy. In Mason's heavily insulated world, every minor mistake had always been swiftly erased by his parents' influence, and every athletic achievement had been wildly over-celebrated by an adoring town. This constant, unearned validation created a dangerous psychological echo chamber, convincing him that he was an apex predator operating entirely outside the boundaries of human morality. He didn't view the Miller family as human beings with hopes, dreams, and right to life. He viewed them merely as disposable props in a dark, twisted movie where he was the untouchable star and director. The deeply tragic dynamic between Mason and his best friend Julian also serves as a haunting case study in the power of toxic, unequal relationships. In every horrific crime orchestrated by a charismatic leader, there is often a quiet, easily manipulated follower who provides the necessary audience for the predator's massive ego. Mason deliberately chose Julian, not because he valued his friendship, but because he correctly recognized Julian's deep-seated insecurities and desperate need to belong. He groomed Julian to be a silent, compliant vault for his darkest impulses, fully expecting the boy's fear to outweigh his moral compass. But Mason's fatal miscalculation was underestimating the unbearable, crushing weight of a guilty conscience. Julian's brave choice to shatter that toxic bond and walk into the police precinct is a powerful reminder that even in the darkest, most manipulative environments, the fundamental human drive to seek justice can miraculously survive and ultimately triumph. The aftermath of the tragedy also forces a deeply uncomfortable mirror onto the community itself, particularly regarding the dangers of blind, suburban denial. Mason's parents, who furiously spent their fortune trying to overturn a completely legitimate conviction, represent a terrifying form of parental enabling that prioritizes social reputation over absolute truth. By consistently shielding Mason from the natural, minor consequences of his bad behavior during his childhood, they unintentionally paved a smooth, unobstructed road toward a catastrophic tragedy. Their absolute refusal to look at the undeniable evidence and accept the monstrous reality of their own son highlights how dangerous it can be when a community collectively decides to look the other way simply because the suspect plays on the varsity team and comes from a good family. The tragedy of the Miller family is a devastating, permanent reminder that monsters are not born in the shadows. They are often grown in brightly lit, beautifully manicured neighborhoods where people are simply too polite to ask the difficult questions. Today, the legacy of this horrific case extends far beyond the quiet borders of Crestview, fundamentally altering how the justice system views violent juvenile offenders. For decades, the legal presumption was that a teenager's undeveloped brain inherently lacked the capacity for true, calculated malice, often resulting in lighter sentences and sealed records. However, the sheer, undeniable premeditation of Mason's actions, the dark clothing, the hidden digital footprint, the remorseless laughter in the interrogation room, completely shattered that naive illusion. It proved to lawmakers and cynical juries alike that absolute evil does not have a strict age requirement. When a 16-year-old demonstrates the cold, calculating precision of a seasoned serial killer, the justice system must respond with an equal, uncompromising severity. The judge's historic decision to hand down a life sentence without parole set a powerful, unyielding precedent, ensuring that extreme youth can no longer be used as a convenient shield for extreme brutality. As the years continue to pass, the memory of the golden boy who threw his entire life away for a sick thrill serves as a dark, cautionary fable for the modern age. Behind the high gray walls of the state penitentiary, the boy who once demanded the attention of an entire town is now entirely invisible, his arrogant voice permanently swallowed by the deafening, monotonous hum of the prison block. He has decades left to stare at the ceiling and replay the exact moment his perfect, invincible illusion shattered. The community has slowly healed, but they will never forget the incredibly heavy price of their former innocence. The smirk that once chilled an entire courtroom has been entirely erased, replaced by the quiet, absolute finality of a deeply deserved punishment. If you believe that true justice requires holding everyone accountable, regardless of their age or their last name, make sure to subscribe and share this story so the innocent are never forgotten. When the national news vans finally packed up their miles of tangled cables and drove away from the Crestview courthouse, an unsettling, deafening silence descended upon the town. The relentless, blinding glare of the media spotlight had temporarily distracted the community from the agonizing reality of their loss. But now, they were forced to sit quietly with the wreckage. The vibrant illusion of their perfectly safe, heavily insulated suburban paradise was irreparably shattered. Neighbors who once chatted endlessly and happily over low white picket fences now exchanged nervous, fleeting glances, quietly wondering what other dark, horrifying secrets might be carefully hidden behind the freshly painted front doors of their idyllic street. Inside the quiet halls of Crestview High, the administration faced the grim, unprecedented task of erasing a ghost who was still very much alive. Mason's name was methodically and entirely scrubbed from every athletic record. His massive championship banners were quietly pulled down under the heavy cover of darkness, and his varsity locker was permanently bolted shut. But erasing his physical presence could not erase the deep, lingering psychological scars he left on his peers. Teenagers who had once idolized his effortless charm were now thrust into intensive grief counseling, struggling desperately to reconcile the charismatic team captain they cheered for with the cold-blooded predator who had sat beside them in homeroom. The profound, lingering trauma of the case extended far beyond the schoolyard, permanently altering the seasoned detectives who had expertly cornered the arrogant teenager. Lead investigators, who had spent decades staring directly into the dead eyes of hardened career criminals, found themselves deeply haunted by the chilling emptiness of Mason's courtroom smirk. They suffered through endless, sleepless nights, constantly replaying the interrogation tapes in their minds, deeply disturbed by the sheer, unadulterated pleasure the boy took in his own deception. It was a terrifying, career-defining reminder that true, absolute malice doesn't always come from a broken background of poverty or abuse. Sometimes, it is born in the lap of absolute luxury. Driven by the immense, burning public outrage surrounding the brutal crime, state legislators swiftly moved to close the dangerous legal loopholes that Mason had so arrogantly tried to exploit. A sweeping, unprecedented new wave of juvenile justice reform was passionately drafted, specifically targeting violent offenders who demonstrated a clear, sophisticated understanding of their digital footprint and forensic evasion. The new, unforgiving laws ensured that teenage suspects who exhibited the calculated, predatory behavior of adult serial killers would be permanently stripped of their protective juvenile status. Mason's horrifying legacy became the ultimate catalyst for a sweeping legal revolution, ensuring his privileged name would only be remembered as a dark, cautionary tale. This monumental, sweeping shift in the legal landscape sent massive shockwaves through affluent communities across the entire country, fundamentally changing the modern paradigm of suburban parenting. The age-old, deeply flawed and dangerous defense of "boys will be boys" was entirely incinerated by the terrifying reality of Mason's calculated actions. Parents were suddenly forced to confront the incredibly dangerous consequences of blindly enabling their children and perpetually shielding them from genuine accountability. The tragic, senseless destruction of the Miller family served as a brutal, unforgettable wake-up call, proving that actively teaching empathy and strict moral boundaries is infinitely more crucial than securing a spot on the varsity roster or maintaining a pristine family image. Meanwhile, Julian quietly continued his deeply personal, lifelong crusade to transform his agonizing trauma into a powerful protective shield for others. As he rapidly progressed through his rigorous university studies in abnormal psychology, he dedicated his entire thesis to identifying the subtle, early warning signs of juvenile malignant narcissism. He bravely used his own horrifying first-hand experience to deeply educate future law enforcement officers and mental health professionals, teaching them exactly how to spot the dangerous, manipulative charm that slick predators use to blindly groom their inner circle. His quiet life became a beautiful, living tribute to the victims, proving that even the most devastating betrayals can spark a legacy of profound healing. Miles away from the slowly healing town, the harsh, unforgiving reality of a life sentence was systematically and brutally breaking Mason's deeply fractured mind. Entirely stripped of his wealthy enablers, his expensive tailored clothes, and his captive audience, he was reduced to a mere anonymous number in a sprawling, terrifying concrete wasteland. The older, deeply hardened inmates had absolutely no respect for a privileged, arrogant teenager who had violently destroyed an innocent family for a cheap thrill, leaving Mason entirely isolated and constantly looking over his shoulder in absolute terror. The terrifying, godlike power he felt on the night of the crime had completely evaporated, replaced by a suffocating, paralyzing fear that would be his only companion for the rest of his natural life. The boy who had once laughed directly in the face of absolute tragedy, completely convinced that his elevated social status made him an untouchable force of nature, was finally forced to bow to the uncompromising, heavy weight of the universe. Every single time he closes his eyes in his dark, narrow cell, he is endlessly tormented by the echoing memory of the heavy wooden gavel striking the judge's bench, a sound that permanently sealed his miserable fate. He masterfully engineered his own spectacular, highly public downfall through sheer, unfiltered arrogance, proving that the brightest, most privileged futures can be instantly incinerated by a single, horrific choice. The arrogant smirk is gone forever, and the monster is exactly where he belongs. Time is often said to heal all wounds, but in Crestview, the calendar only served as a relentless reminder of the innocence they had violently lost. A full decade had evaporated since the heavy prison doors slammed shut on their golden boy, and while the physical town had modernized with new storefronts and fresh paint, the psychological scars remained deeply embedded in the community's foundation. A new generation of high schoolers walked the same polished hallways, completely unaware of the dark history hidden beneath their feet. But for the adults who lived through the nightmare, the 10-year anniversary of the tragedy brought a suffocating wave of anxiety. It was a grim milestone no one wanted to acknowledge, yet everyone silently dreaded, knowing the national media was inevitably going to drag their darkest chapter back into the unforgiving light. The quiet dread morphed into harsh reality when a renowned investigative journalist arrived in the wealthy suburbs,
determined to peel back the remaining layers of Mason's polished facade. This wasn't just another sensational recap of the horrific crime.
The deep dive investigation aimed to uncover the silent enablers who had unknowingly paved the way for a monster. The reporter began systematically knocking on doors that had been firmly closed for a decade, speaking with retired teachers, former athletic coaches, and marginalized students who had long ago moved away. What they uncovered was a chilling, perfectly documented trail of glaring red flags that had been intentionally ignored, minimized, or actively buried just to protect the pristine reputation of a rising star. The town was about to realize that Mason's descent into darkness was not a sudden, unpredictable snap, but a slow, heavily protected evolution. The documentary team unearthed long-forgotten disciplinary records from Mason's middle school years, revealing a deeply disturbing pattern of cruelty and emotional manipulation. There were documented instances of him intentionally cornering vulnerable classmates, orchestrating elaborate, malicious rumors, and displaying a shocking lack of empathy when confronted by tearful school counselors. Yet time and time again, these terrifying behavioral warnings were quickly dismissed as mere boys being boys, or falsely attributed to the intense pressure of highly competitive local sports. Because his wealthy family generously funded the athletic department and his undeniable talent practically guaranteed a state championship, the administration had actively chosen to look the other way. They had prioritized shiny glass trophies and deep-pocketed donors over the fundamental safety and moral development of their student body, unknowingly watering the dark seeds of his malignant narcissism. When this explosive new information was finally broadcast to the nation, a fresh, burning wave of absolute rage washed over the Crestview community. The devastating realization that the Miller family's unimaginable tragedy could have potentially been prevented if adults had simply done their required jobs sent powerful shockwaves through the neighborhood. Outraged parents angrily stormed school board meetings, loudly demanding strict, uncompromising accountability for the administrators who had cowardly swept a predator's early warning signs under the rug. It was a massive, highly public reckoning that forced the entire town to confront their own ugly complicity in the creation of a local monster. The comfortable, easy illusion that Mason was just an unpredictable anomaly was entirely shattered, replaced by the terrifying truth that their own vanity and obsession with success had built his impenetrable armor. Watching this long-overdue reckoning unfold from his quiet apartment halfway across the country, Julian felt a profound, heavy sense of validation. For 10 long years, he had carried the agonizing weight of being the sole whistleblower, often losing sleep wondering if he could have somehow recognized the darkness in his former best friend sooner. But seeing the undeniable evidence of Mason's lifelong, systemic manipulation laid bare for the world finally lifted that crushing, unfair burden from Julian's tired shoulders. It proved that the psychological rot ran incredibly deep, far beyond what any terrified teenager could have possibly managed or understood on their own. Julian's incredibly brave choice to step forward into that police precinct a decade ago was definitively recognized not as a betrayal, but as a heroic action that finally broke a systemic cycle of dangerous, willful ignorance. Meanwhile, deep inside the cold, isolated walls of the maximum security state penitentiary, the news of the upcoming high-profile documentary reached Mason's heavily restricted cell block. For the first time in 10 miserable years, a twisted, familiar spark of pure arrogance ignited within his deeply fractured ego. He desperately saw this national broadcast as a golden opportunity to reclaim the massive spotlight he had lost, a chance to manipulate the narrative and perhaps win over a new, gullible audience.
He eagerly reached out to the investigative journalist through his weary legal counsel,
enthusiastically offering an exclusive, on-camera interview to graciously tell his side of the story. In his deeply warped, unchanging mind, he was still the untouchable star of the show, fully expecting the media to trip over themselves for a single, precious moment of his time. But the seasoned journalist, possessing a deep understanding of criminal psychology and absolutely zero tolerance for narcissistic manipulation, delivered a masterclass in poetic justice. She flatly and publicly rejected Mason's desperate offer, outright refusing to give a convicted, remorseless predator the very platform and national attention he so fiercely craved. In her final, powerful broadcast, she didn't show his recent, aging mugshot or play his requested audio clips. Instead, she focused entirely on the beautiful, enduring legacy of the Miller family and the incredible bravery of a loyal friend. She explicitly stated to millions of viewers that true monsters do not deserve a microphone, ensuring that Mason's arrogant voice remained permanently buried beneath the heavy concrete of his miserable reality. It was the ultimate, devastating blow to an ego that required constant outside validation to simply survive. The highly public rejection hit Mason significantly harder than his initial life sentence, entirely destroying the fragile, delusional fantasy world he had carefully maintained behind bars. He was finally forced to comprehend that the world had not only moved on without him, but that they actively and utterly despised the memory of him. There would be no dramatic redemption arc, no adoring fan mail from misguided true crime fans, and absolutely no stage for his dark, twisted theatrics. The former Golden Boy was left to sit completely alone in the deafening silence of his tiny cell, utterly forgotten by the society he had once tried to manipulate like a cheap board game. The heavy iron doors remained firmly locked, and the arrogant teenager who had once laughed at the pain of others was finally consumed by the suffocating, inescapable permanence of his own absolute irrelevance. The fallout from the explosive documentary did not just reverberate through the Crestview community. It sparked a profound, nationwide conversation about the incredibly dangerous intersection of privilege, youth, and the justice system. For years, affluent, predominantly white suburbs had comfortably coasted on the dangerous assumption that violent crime was something that happened somewhere else, a problem exclusive to impoverished cities or broken homes. Mason's chilling story violently shattered that deeply ingrained, inherently flawed narrative. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that malignant narcissism and sociopathic tendencies do not discriminate by zip code or bank account balance. The stark realization that a monster could thrive in an environment of absolute abundance forced sociologists and child psychologists to fundamentally reevaluate the critical importance of teaching emotional intelligence and accountability, regardless of social standing. In the wake of this cultural shift, several prominent legal advocacy groups launched the Miller Initiative, a sweeping national campaign aimed at standardizing the way schools handle early behavioral warning signs. The initiative sought to legally mandate comprehensive empathy training and strict, uniform disciplinary protocols across all school districts, ensuring that no student could ever buy their way out of a psychological evaluation. They fought to implement anonymous, third-party reporting systems for bullying and emotional manipulation, directly bypassing the local school boards, who were often too financially invested in their star students to take appropriate action. The tragic legacy of the Miller family was actively transformed from a localized horror story into a powerful, protective shield designed to safeguard countless other communities from suffering the same preventable fate. Meanwhile, as the nation engaged in this critical, long-overdue reckoning, Julian found himself stepping out of the comfortable shadows he had inhabited for a decade. He was invited to speak before a congressional committee examining juvenile justice reform, an opportunity that terrified him, but one he knew he had to accept. Standing before the panel of lawmakers, he recounted his harrowing experience not with bitterness, but with a profound, quiet strength. He spoke about the terrifying power dynamic of toxic friendships and the immense, almost insurmountable pressure teenagers feel to remain silent when they suspect something is wrong. His powerful testimony provided a crucial, missing perspective, that of the silent bystander, and ultimately helped secure federal funding for advanced psychological intervention programs in secondary schools across the country. Back inside the bleak, unforgiving walls of the maximum security state penitentiary, Mason's reality had devolved into a miserable, monotonous loop of deep regret and absolute irrelevance. The once charming, arrogant teenager was now a hardened, deeply bitter man, his face etched with the harsh lines of a decade spent entirely without hope. He no longer possessed the energy or the desire to manipulate the other inmates. He had learned the hard way that his silver tongue held absolutely no power in a world governed by brute force and institutional survival. The crushing weight of his life sentence, devoid of any possibility of parole, had finally completely crushed his malignant ego. He was forced to live every single day with the agonizing knowledge that he had willingly traded a life of infinite possibilities for a cold, concrete cage. On the 15th anniversary of the tragedy, a small, quiet gathering took place at the site where the Miller home once stood. The new owners, honoring the solemn history of the property, had transformed the large front yard into a beautiful, vibrant community garden. Dozens of neighbors, alongside Julian and the surviving members of the Miller family, came together to plant a new row of sturdy oak trees. There were no news cameras, no flashy speeches, and no dramatic recounting of the crime. It was simply a peaceful, enduring testament to the resilience of a community that refused to let darkness have the final word. The garden stood as a quiet, living promise that while the scars of that horrific night would never fully fade, they would be used to nurture something beautiful. The story of the arrogant teenager who thought he could outsmart the world serves as a permanent, chilling reminder that justice is an uncompromising force that cannot be endlessly evaded. Mason started his horrifying journey laughing in the face of unimaginable tragedy, fully convinced that his elevated social status made him an untouchable god among ordinary men. But the universe, guided by the incredibly brave actions of a true friend, ultimately demanded absolute accountability. He engineered his own spectacular downfall, proving that the brightest, most privileged futures can be instantly incinerated by a single, horrific choice. The arrogant smirk is gone forever, replaced by the quiet, absolute finality of a deeply deserved punishment. And the monster remains exactly where he belongs. As the decades slowly marched forward, the Crestview tragedy evolved from a sensational local news story into a foundational pillar of modern forensic psychology. Inside the highly secure walls of the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, the chilling details of Mason's calculated crime became required reading for every new class of criminal profilers. Experts coined the term the Crestview illusion to describe the terrifying phenomenon where immense wealth, social privilege, and athletic prowess successfully mask profound sociopathic tendencies. They meticulously dissected Mason's interrogation tapes, teaching future detectives how to look past a polished, affluent exterior and identify the absolute void of empathy hiding just behind a confident, practiced teenage smile. Julian's groundbreaking academic work played a massive role in this national paradigm shift. His detailed thesis on the subtle, early warning signs of juvenile malignant narcissism was actively integrated into the training manuals of school resource officers across the country. He expertly broke down the exact methods manipulative predators use to groom vulnerable followers, using his own agonizing high school experience as the ultimate, undeniable proof. By bravely stepping into the harsh, unforgiving light, Julian transformed his deepest personal trauma into a powerful protective tool. He ensured that law enforcement no longer viewed affluent suburbs as inherently safe zones, completely changing how authorities approach reports of emotional abuse in wealthy, insulated communities. The profound, life-saving impact of these new protocols was quietly proven just a few years later in a similarly wealthy, sports-obsessed town halfway across the country. A veteran high school teacher, deeply trained under the new Miller Initiative guidelines, noticed a charismatic star quarterback exhibiting the exact same terrifying red flags that Mason had displayed. Instead of cowardly looking the other way to protect the school's precious championship dreams, the teacher immediately triggered the newly established anonymous intervention protocols. The student was quietly removed from the classroom, intensely evaluated by independent state psychologists, and found to be actively plotting a devastating, highly coordinated attack against his unsuspecting peers. Because of the agonizing lessons learned from the Crestview tragedy, a catastrophic nightmare was entirely prevented before a single drop of blood could be shed. The Miller family's devastating loss had directly resulted in the salvation of countless other innocent lives, transforming their profound grief into a beautiful, enduring legacy of protection. It is a deeply poetic, powerful form of justice that the very community Mason tried to violently destroy ended up creating an unbreakable shield against predators just like him. The darkness he introduced to the world was ultimately overpowered by a massive, sweeping wave of systemic, protective light that will continue saving lives for generations to come. Meanwhile, the stark reality of life inside the maximum security state penitentiary has taken a severe, undeniable physical and mental toll on the former Golden Boy. Now approaching his mid-30s, Mason looks absolutely nothing like the confident, vibrant varsity captain who once arrogantly smirked his way through a highly publicized murder trial. The harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights and the heavily restricted prison diet have permanently stripped away his athletic physique, leaving behind a gaunt, deeply aged man who looks decades older than he actually is. His posture, once characterized by a dominating, arrogant swagger, is now permanently hunched, physically crushed by the heavy, inescapable weight of his own absolute irrelevance. For a malignant narcissist who spent his entire youth thriving on the constant, adoring validation of a captive audience, this profound, suffocating isolation is a fate far worse than death. On the rare occasions he is permitted into the noisy, crowded common areas, he is entirely ignored by the hardened prison population, viewed merely as a pathetic, aging relic of a deeply cowardly crime. He occasionally catches fleeting glimpses of national news segments discussing the sweeping juvenile justice reforms he unknowingly inspired, but his name is never, ever mentioned. He is completely erased from his own dark narrative, denied the infamous, terrifying legacy his massive ego so desperately craved when he planned the crime. In a desperate, pathetic attempt to reclaim even a tiny fraction of his former social power, Mason occasionally tries to send handwritten letters to his former high school classmates. He writes manipulative, sprawling pages filled with fabricated excuses and demands for sympathy, stubbornly refusing to take any genuine accountability for the horrific destruction he caused. But every single letter is promptly returned to sender, completely unopened and marked with bold, red rejection stamps. The outside world has entirely moved on, leaving him trapped in a pathetic, unchanging loop of his own delusions. He is completely walled off from humanity, his desperate cries for attention echoing uselessly against the cold, unforgiving concrete of his tiny, miserable cell. The ultimate satisfying truth of this chilling story is the beautiful, undeniable contrast between the lives of the two former best friends. Julian, who bravely chose the agonizing path of truth, is now a highly respected professional, living a life rich with purpose, love, and profound meaning. Mason, who arrogantly believed he was a god above the law, is now a forgotten, invisible prisoner with absolutely nothing to look forward to but the endless passage of time. If this incredible story of betrayal, courage, and ultimate justice resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and remind everyone that true accountability always catches up, no matter how fast you try to run. The ripple effects of the Crestview tragedy continued to fundamentally reshape the landscape of juvenile justice and community psychology, serving as a dark catalyst for profound systemic change. As the decades passed, the phrase "the Crestview illusion" transitioned from a niche academic term into a universally recognized concept, appearing in textbooks, policy briefings, and training seminars for educators nationwide. It became the definitive shorthand for the dangerous phenomenon where immense privilege and societal adoration create an impenetrable shield around a malignant narcissist, allowing devastating cruelty to flourish completely undetected until it is far too late. The story of Mason's spectacular downfall became a mandatory, chilling case study for anyone entrusted with the care and evaluation of young people, permanently altering how society views the intersection of youth, wealth, and violence. One of the most significant enduring legacies of the case was the widespread implementation of the Miller Protocols in high schools across the country. Born from the agonizing lessons of the Crestview tragedy, these protocols mandated rigorous third-party psychological evaluations for any student displaying a consistent pattern of emotional manipulation or predatory behavior, regardless of their athletic standing or family wealth. It stripped local school boards of their ability to sweep alarming red flags under the rug to protect their star athletes, ensuring that early intervention was no longer a suggestion, but a strict legal requirement. The Miller family's unimaginable grief had been actively transformed into a powerful nationwide protective shield, ensuring that no community would ever again be blinded by the dazzling glare of a golden boy's false promise. In the midst of this sweeping systemic evolution, Julian continued his quiet, purposeful life, forever changed by the harrowing ordeal, but deeply committed to ensuring his friend's betrayal was not in vain. He became a leading voice in the field of forensic psychology, specializing in the early detection and treatment of juvenile sociopathy. He often traveled to affluent, insulated communities, much like the one he grew up in, delivering powerful, sobering lectures on the critical importance of dismantling the dangerous echo chambers of privilege. He spoke with the quiet, unshakable authority of someone who had stared directly into the abyss, and chosen to build a bridge over it, his life serving as a beautiful, enduring testament to the profound power of moral courage. Back within the heavily fortified, unforgiving walls of the maximum security state penitentiary, Mason's existence had settled into a grim, unyielding permanence. The arrogant, untouchable teenager who once believed he was entirely above the law was now a deeply institutionalized, forgotten man, entirely consumed by the monotonous, inescapable routine of prison life. The charismatic sneer that had once chilled a crowded courtroom was long gone, replaced by the hollow, defeated stare of someone who finally understood the absolute, terrifying finality of a life sentence without the possibility of parole. He had engineered his own spectacular downfall through sheer, unadulterated hubris, completely obliterating a future of infinite possibilities for a fleeting, sickening moment of perceived control. As the years stretched into decades, the memory of Mason's highly publicized trial faded from the public consciousness, entirely eclipsed by the massive wave of protective reforms it had unknowingly inspired. He was no longer the infamous, terrifying figure he had desperately sought to become. He was merely a cautionary footnote in the history of juvenile justice, a dark example of what happens when absolute privilege collides with absolute darkness. He remained entirely isolated, his desperate letters continuing to be returned unopened, his arrogant voice permanently swallowed by the deafening silence of a society that had completely, utterly moved on without him. The boy who thought he was a god learned the agonizing truth. He was nothing more than a prisoner of his own devastating vanity. The Crestview tragedy remains a deeply powerful, enduring masterclass in the terrifying depths of human arrogance and the unyielding, inevitable nature of justice. It forces us to confront the deeply uncomfortable reality that the most dangerous monsters often hide in plain sight, comfortably shielded by the very institutions designed to protect us. Yet, it also offers a profound, luminous message of hope, demonstrating how incredible bravery and an unwavering commitment to the truth can ultimately dismantle even the most heavily fortified illusions. If you found this exploration of psychology, privilege, and ultimate accountability compelling, please subscribe to the channel and let us know your thoughts in the comments below.